Without me, he'd be filing for bankruptcy by spring. My stepfather said it loud enough for the entire conference room to hear, loud enough that the court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard. The mediator looked at me, waiting. My stepfather's attorney smirked and slid a folder across the table, like he was laying down a winning hand. Then the bank's regional director, sitting quietly in the corner because I'd asked him to be there, cleared his throat. Actually, she's the one who approved the refinancing on this building. My stepfather's face didn't just go pale. It went the color of old paper. My name is Margaret. I'm 38 years old, and 4 months ago I sat in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Charlotte and watched the man who raised me realize in real time that he'd spent a decade underestimating the wrong woman. I should back up. Not to the beginning of my life, just to the Sunday dinner that started this particular war, because that's where the first match got struck. It was the second Sunday of October, the kind of crisp fall evening where the light through my stepfather's dining room windows turns everything gold and expensive looking, which is exactly how he liked it. Roger had married my mother when I was 9, and for 29 years he'd run our family like a company where he was the only shareholder. The dining room at his house in Myers Park smelled like the same rosemary chicken his housekeeper made every single Sunday, a smell I associated less with comfort than with bracing myself. At the head of the table, Roger held court the way he always did, swirling wine he didn't need to swirl, telling a story about a deal he'd closed that everyone at the table had already heard twice. To his right sat my half-brother Preston, 32, who worked in business development at Roger's commercial real estate firm, which was a generous way of saying he showed up to lunches Roger had already closed and took the client out for golf. Preston's wife, Sloane, sat beside him in a blazer that cost more than my first car, nodding at everything Roger said with the kind of devotion usually reserved for cult leaders. And then there was me, at the far end of the table, where I'd been seated since I was a teenager, which tells you everything about where Roger thought I belonged. For the first half of dinner, it was the usual theater. Sloane complained about the contractor renovating their lake house, fishing for Roger to just handle it the way he handled everything for them. Preston laughed too hard at his own jokes. My mother, who had learned 30 years ago that the path of least resistance in this house was silence, refreshed everyone's wine and said almost nothing. Then Roger turned to me, and I felt the temperature in the room change, the way it always did right before he wanted an audience for something. "So, Margaret." He said my name like it tasted slightly bad in his mouth. "Still doing the bookkeeping thing?" "I do payroll administration," I told him, which was true in the same way that saying I do numbers would be true. I'd built a career in financial operations that none of them had ever bothered to ask a real question about, because in this family, what you did only mattered if it came with a title Roger could repeat at the country club. "Bookkeeping," he repeated, and Preston snorted into his wine like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "You know, Margaret, I worry about you. 38, renting that little apartment off South Boulevard, no husband, no real assets to your name. I built an empire from nothing so this family would never have to worry about money again, and you're out there counting other people's paychecks." "It's stable work," I said. "Stable." He said the word like it was an insult, which, from him, it was. Roger had built Caldwell Commercial Properties from a single strip mall into a portfolio of office buildings and retail centers across 3 states, and he never let anyone forget it, especially not me. The stepdaughter who'd had the audacity not to follow him into the family business 12 years ago, when he offered me what he called an opportunity and what I'd quickly understood was a leash. "You know what your problem is," Roger continued, warming up now, the way he did when he had an audience. "You never wanted to actually build anything. You wanted to play it safe your whole life. Meanwhile, Preston here just helped me close on that new building downtown, the one on Trade Street. $11 million, Margaret. 11. While you're filing other people's W-2s. Congratulations," I said, and I meant it, mostly, because Preston closing a deal Roger had already negotiated wasn't exactly news, but I wasn't going to fight about it at the table. That should have been the end of it. It usually was. Roger would get his dig in, Preston would gloat, Sloane would steer the conversation back to her contractor problems, and I'd drive home replaying it the way I always did, wondering why I kept showing up to be reminded of my place. But Sloane wasn't done. "Honestly, Margaret, it's almost sad," she said, swirling her wine the way she'd clearly learned from watching Roger do it for 6 years. "Preston and I are about to close on a second lake house. Roger's helping us with the down payment, obviously. Meanwhile, you're what, still driving that Honda? I just think it's good you've made peace with a smaller life. Not everyone's built for more. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my hands folded in my lap and said nothing, because that's what I'd trained myself to do for 29 years in this house. I let it wash over me the way you let cold water wash over you in the shower before it turns warm, just waiting. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever once thought to ask, was that the bookkeeping thing I did was actually senior-level commercial lending operations at Granite Trust Bank, one of the largest regional commercial lenders in the Southeast, and that for the past 4 years I had personally overseen the loan portfolio for half the small and mid-sized commercial real estate developers in Mecklenburg County, including, as of 14 months ago, Caldwell Commercial Properties. Roger didn't know it was me. He'd never once looked closely enough at the underwriting team behind his refinancing deals to notice my name buried in the documentation, because in his mind I wasn't the kind of person who'd be in a position like that. He'd applied for an aggressive refinance package the previous year to fund his expansion, including that $11 million building on Trade Street that Preston was so proud of, and I had been the one who structured the terms, who'd fought internally to get him better rates than he probably deserved, given how leveraged he already was, who had quietly, professionally, done my job well for a man who thought I counted other people's paychecks for a living. I debated for months whether to recuse myself from his accounts entirely. Ethically, I should have, but Roger had never once recused himself from controlling every part of my life, my education, my trust fund, the husband he'd tried to pick out for me when I was 26. So somewhere along the way I decided that watching his empire from the inside, quietly, carefully, without anyone knowing, was the closest thing to peace I'd ever get from this family. I just didn't expect to need that knowledge as a weapon. Not yet. The dinner ended the way it always did, with Roger raising a glass to real success and looking pointedly at Preston, and me driving home in my Honda with my hands tight on the wheel, telling myself this was the last one. I'd told myself that after every Sunday dinner for 2 years. This time, though, something had shifted. Maybe it was turning 38 that week, and realizing I'd spent half my adult life rehearsing my own smallness for an audience that had already decided who I was. Maybe it was the particular cruelty in Sloane's voice, the satisfaction in it, like watching me struggle was a hobby she enjoyed. 3 days later, on a Wednesday, I got the call that would turn this into a war neither of them saw coming. It came from my supervisor, David Chen, the senior VP of commercial lending, and his voice had the flat, careful tone he used when something was about to land on my desk that I wasn't going to like. "Margaret, I need you in my office," he said. "It's about the Caldwell commercial portfolio." I sat down across from David 15 minutes later, and he slid a file across his desk. The same gesture I'd later realize that Roger's attorney would mimic in that conference room 4 months later, except David's gesture came from concern, not cruelty. "Caldwell's missed 2 consecutive debt service covenant tests," David said. "The Trade Street acquisition over-leveraged them more than their projections accounted for, and 2 of their anchor tenants in the retail portfolio just gave notice they're not renewing. We're looking at a borrower in technical default within the next 2 quarters if nothing changes." I kept my face perfectly still, the same way I had at that dinner table 3 days earlier, while internally something shifted into focus with a clarity I hadn't expected. "I need you to run the workout analysis," David continued. "You know this portfolio better than anyone on the team. I want options on my desk by Friday, forbearance, restructuring, or," he paused, "if it comes to it, what our exposure looks like in a foreclosure scenario." Foreclosure. The word sat in the air between us, and I thought about Roger at the head of that table, swirling wine he didn't need to swirl, telling me I'd never built anything, while 3 days earlier his entire empire had been quietly, invisibly cracking under the weight of his own ego. "I'll have it ready," I told David, and I meant it. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. I did not go looking for Roger's downfall. I did not manufacture his default or sabotage his loan or do anything except my job, which I happen to be extremely good at. Roger built his own collapse, brick by brick, the same way he'd built his empire, by believing he was untouchable, by over-leveraging a deal his own son hadn't done the diligence to flag, by treating his lenders the way he treated his family, like people who existed to serve his ambition and not ask questions. What I did was watch it happen with a kind of grim, exhausted clarity, and then I did my job. Over the following weeks, I ran the numbers 6 different ways, and every version told the same story. Caldwell Commercial Properties was overextended in a way that had nothing to do with bad luck and everything to do with hubris. The Trade Street building, the one Preston had bragged about at dinner like he'd personally negotiated genius into existence, had been acquired at the absolute peak of the market, financed with an aggressive interest-only structure that Roger had insisted on against the advice of his own financial advisor, because Roger didn't take advice, he gave it. I drafted the workout analysis with the same care I gave every file, because that's who I am, even when the file has my stepfather's name on it. I laid out 3 paths: a forbearance agreement that would buy 6 months but required significant new collateral, a restructuring that would convert Roger's ownership structure and dilute his control significantly, or, if he refused both, formal default proceedings that would put the bank in a position to pursue the pledged collateral, which, I discovered reading the original loan documents from a year earlier, included the Briarwood Plaza shopping center. Briarwood Plaza wasn't just any property. It was the first thing Roger ever built. The strip mall that became the seat of everything else. The one he talked about at every single family gathering like it was a war memorial. He'd pledged it as collateral on the Trade Street deal because he was so confident the deal would print money that he never imagined needing an exit. I brought the analysis to David on Friday morning, and by Monday, the bank had scheduled a formal meeting with Caldwell Commercial Properties to discuss their options. I requested to be present, which was standard for the analyst who'd run the workout. David didn't think twice about it. Why would he? As far as the bank was concerned, I was Margaret Voss, senior credit analyst. Voss was my mother's name before she remarried, the name I'd quietly kept on my professional license even after she took Roger's name, the one small act of independence nobody in my family had ever noticed or cared enough to ask about. I called my mother that weekend, partly out of guilt, and partly because I needed to hear someone say it wasn't crazy to let this happen. He's never once asked me a real question about my life. I told her, sitting in my car outside her house because I couldn't bring myself to go inside and risk Roger overhearing. 29 years, Mom. He doesn't know my job title. He doesn't know I make 6 figures. He thinks I drive a Honda because I can't afford better, not because I just don't care about driving something that costs more than my retirement contributions. My mother was quiet for a long moment. I should have stood up for you more, she said finally. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what he's like. But Margaret, if you're about to do what I think you're about to do, you need to know I'm not going to beg you to stop. That was as close to a blessing as I was going to get, and it was enough. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, in a conference room on the 14th floor of Granite Trust's downtown headquarters. I dressed carefully that morning, a charcoal suit I'd bought for exactly this kind of room, and I sat in my office for 20 minutes before the meeting just breathing, because some part of me, even after everything, still felt 9 years old whenever I thought about being in a room with Roger and having him look at me like I mattered. I walked into the conference room at 9:58 a.m. David was already there, along with our bank's regional director, Harold Pruitt, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who'd been doing commercial workouts for 25 years and didn't blink at much anymore. I took my seat at the side of the table where the analyst usually sat, slightly removed from the principal negotiation, exactly where Roger would expect someone like me to be, invisible, supporting, unimportant. Roger walked in 2 minutes later with his attorney, a sharp, expensive-looking man named Dale Whitfield, and Preston trailing behind them carrying a leather portfolio he clearly didn't know what to do with. Roger didn't look at me. Why would he? He had no reason to think his stepdaughter, the bookkeeper, would be anywhere near a room discussing the fate of his company. "Gentlemen," Roger said, settling into his chair with the same expansive confidence he brought to every room, including his own dining table, "I appreciate you taking the time, but I think there's been some overcaution here. Caldwell Commercial has weathered cycles before. We are not in distress, we're in a temporary adjustment period, and frankly, I'd expect a bank we've done business with for 15 years to extend a little more good faith." Dale Whitfield slid a folder across the table, the gesture I'd remember for the rest of my life, smooth and practiced. The gesture of a man who'd never once had a deal not go his way. "My client has reviewed the bank's preliminary workout proposal," Whitfield said, "and frankly we find the terms punitive given the strength of the underlying assets. We're prepared to discuss a simple maturity extension, nothing more aggressive than that." Harold glanced at me, the cue I'd been waiting for. Before we get into terms, Harold said, I'd like our credit analyst to walk through the underwriting findings, since she's the one who structured the original facility and ran the current workout analysis. I watched Roger's face as he registered the word she, watched him glance toward me for the first time since walking into the room, watched the half-second of confusion cross his face, the kind of confusion you have when something familiar appears somewhere it doesn't belong, like seeing your dentist at the grocery store. Margaret, he said, and I heard, for the first time in 29 years, genuine surprise in his voice when he said my name. Good morning, Roger, I said, and I kept my voice exactly as professional and even as I would have for any other client, because that's what he was now. A client, a borrower, a man whose empire I was about to walk through the dismantling of with the same careful neutrality I gave every account. I opened my laptop and pulled up the analysis, and for the next 20 minutes I walked the room through the numbers. The debt service coverage ratio that had fallen below covenant requirements for 2 consecutive quarters. The vacancy rate climbing in the retail portfolio. The interest-only structure on the Trade Street acquisition that had left almost no equity cushion when the market softened. I didn't editorialize, I didn't need to. The numbers told a story Roger had spent 30 years refusing to hear from anyone, which was that ambition without discipline eventually runs out of road. This is absurd, Roger said partway through, his voice rising. You're telling me my own stepdaughter is sitting here trying to tank my company? I'm not trying to do anything except my job, Roger, I said. I structured the original financing on Trade Street 14 months ago. I fought to get you better terms than the deal probably warranted, given how leveraged you already were. You signed those terms. The covenants you're in breach of are the ones your own attorney reviewed and approved. Whitfield's expression flickered, just slightly, the look of a lawyer realizing his client had perhaps not mentioned a few relevant details about his lending relationships before walking into this meeting. Without me, Roger said, and his voice had gone sharp and loud now, the same voice he used at the head of his dining table, the voice that had never once in 29 years been told no in a room that mattered. This whole family would have nothing. I built every single thing in this room, in my life, from nothing, and now I'm supposed to sit here and let the daughter who never built a single thing dictate terms to me. I didn't build Caldwell Commercial, that's true, I said quietly. But I'm the one who spent the last 4 years keeping your loans performing well enough that you could keep building it. And right now, the bank's exposure on this portfolio is significant enough that the decision about what happens next isn't really yours to dictate either, Roger. It's a negotiation. And you don't have the leverage in it that you think you do. That was when Harold, who'd been quiet and watchful through all of it, finally spoke. Mr. Caldwell, I'll be direct with you, since your attorney seems to be working with incomplete information. The bank holds a first position lien on Briarwood Plaza, pledged as collateral on the Trade Street facility. Given the current default status, we have the contractual right to pursue that collateral as part of any restructuring. We'd prefer not to. We'd much rather work out terms that let your business stabilize. But that requires you to negotiate in good faith, starting now, instead of telling us we should extend trust we've already extended once and gotten burned on. Roger's face went the color of old paper, Briarwood Plaza. The one thing he'd never once imagined losing, sitting in a folder on a conference table because he'd been so certain of his own invincibility that he'd risked it without a second thought. Preston, who'd been silent through all of this, finally found his voice. Dad, did you pledge Briarwood as collateral? You never told me that. It wasn't your business to know, Roger snapped, and I watched something flicker across Preston's face that looked, for the first time in his entire pampered life, like genuine fear about what his future actually looked like if his father's empire collapsed. The meeting went on for another hour, and by the end of it, Roger had agreed, because he had no other choice, to a restructuring that included new equity infusion, a significant dilution of his ownership control, and a personal guarantee that put his other assets, including his Myers Park house, on the line if the restructured terms weren't met. It wasn't a destruction. I want to be clear about that because I never wanted to destroy him. Not really, not even after everything. It was a correction, the kind of correction the market and his own decisions had been building toward for over a year. The kind of correction that happened to 100 over-leveraged developers across the Southeast that same year, except this one happened to have my name attached to the underwriting. As the meeting broke up, Roger lingered by the door while Whitfield and Preston packed up their things, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something between humiliation and something that might have been, if I squinted, the beginning of actual respect. "You've been sitting on this for over a year," he said quietly, just to me. "You know everything about my finances, and you never the word. You never asked me a real question about my life in 29 years, Roger," I said. I figured I'd return the favor. He didn't have anything to say to that. He just picked up his coat and walked out, and I sat alone in that conference room for a few minutes afterward, not triumphant. Exactly, just quiet. The way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. The fallout took a few months to fully settle. Roger kept Caldwell Commercial Properties, restructured and considerably humbled, with new equity partners who had real oversight over his decisions for the first time in his career. Preston and Sloane sold their lake house. The second one Roger had been helping finance within 6 weeks, and I heard through my mother that Sloane had taken a job in retail management, the kind of smaller life she'd once told me I should make peace with. My mother left Roger 4 months after that conference room meeting, not because of the financial collapse itself, she told me, but because watching him in that room had shown her something about who he really was that she'd spent 29 years not letting herself see clearly. She moved into a condo near downtown, and we have dinner together every other Sunday now, just the two of us, somewhere quiet that doesn't smell like rosemary chicken and somebody else's expectations. I still work at Granite Trust. I got promoted to Director of Commercial Credit 6 weeks after the Caldwell restructuring closed, a promotion that had nothing to do with Roger and everything to do with the dozen other accounts I'd managed well for years. The kind of work that had simply never been visible to anyone who mattered to me until it suddenly was. I bought a house last spring, a small craftsman near South End with good light in the kitchen and a yard big enough for the garden I never had room for in the apartment. I drive the same Honda. I like the Honda. It's paid off, and it's never once asked me to be smaller than I am. I see Roger occasionally now, at family functions that have gotten smaller and quieter since the divorce, since my mother stopped performing the marriage she'd been performing for 3 decades. He doesn't swirl wine he doesn't need to swirl anymore. He asks me real questions now, careful ones, the way you'd talk to someone you'd finally realized you should have been paying attention to all along. I answer them. I don't owe him warmth, but I've decided I don't have to carry the weight of withholding it either. That's its own kind of freedom, the kind nobody warns you about. The freedom of getting to choose your own response instead of just reacting to 30 years of somebody else's certainty about who you are. What I learned, sitting in that conference room, watching the man who spent my whole life telling me I'd never built anything finally understand what I'd quietly built without him noticing, is that you don't have to announce your power for it to be real. You don't have to perform your worth at a dinner table for people who've already decided not to see it. You just have to keep building, quietly, carefully, on your own terms, until the day the truth simply walks into the room and sits down, and there's nothing left for anyone to do but watch it take a seat.